Why is this an important topic, sir?
Well, it's not just an important topic to me, it's an important topic, period. You know, this is an arid region, and the reason that there has ever been human settlement on this land is because these two rivers meet here. But not to put too fine a point on it, by about 2036, we're going to hit the limit of our water license, particularly on hot days in the summer. And the water shortages will only increase from there. So it's important now that we start making the decisions we have to make around development, growth throughout the region, conservation, how we pay for water, to make sure that we can accommodate the growth that we expect here over the next decades.
I have not heard this idea before that SR1 might become a full-time year-round reservoir.
Oh, it's my favorite topic. Since the beginning of our conversation on the Springbank off-stream reservoir, I've always thought that it should be a reservoir. You know, the City of Calgary's point of view has always been that we have to do integrated watershed management for drought and for flood. Now, we abandoned Springbank being a reservoir some time ago because a reservoir on the Bow River will be more useful. That said, you know, I know that the new government is in the midst of doing some more analysis on Springbank, and if this is somewhere that they want to go, we can certainly help them with the analysis on that.
Is that a major retooling of that project?
I actually don't think so. My understanding is that the engineering of the two, the dry dam and the reservoir, is very, very similar. A little more work is needed for a reservoir, but not a ton more. Now, that said, I haven't looked at the engineering drawings, and even if I did, I wouldn't be able to read them, but that is my understanding.
So why is council going through this exercise? You'd suggest you have experts in admin, and those guys would come up with solutions, and then you guys would take a look at it. What's the point of you guys doing that?
It really is about level setting. It's important for us as policymakers to understand these issues. So, for example, when we are deciding how many new neighborhoods that we're going to approve in the city, we don't really think about them in terms of water, and we particularly don't think about them in terms of stormwater, which is part 2 today. How do we do the drainage? How do we loop all that in? How do we avoid flooding? And so I thought it was really important for council as policymakers to really understand the impacts of our water decision, the impacts of our decisions on the watershed.
Mr. Nenshi, what's your reaction to Westjet being bought by Onex based in Toronto?
What a morning I've had. Woke up to that news this morning, and I've had the opportunity to spend some time with Ed Sims, the CEO of Westjet, as well as the folks from Onex. I've asked a lot of tough questions. What I was very pleased to hear is that in this decision, which is, after all, a $5 billion investment in a Calgary company, that Westjet is committed to keeping their headquarters, as they said, proudly and permanently in Calgary, that they understand the importance of the Calgary culture to Westjet's success, and that no jobs will be lost as a result of this transaction. So, you know, I asked a tough question to the private equity guys, saying, look, if I can be crazy reductionist about this, private equity firms buy companies for one of 3 reasons: cut costs, grow the business, or restructure the industry. Which is it? And they said they are entirely focused on growth. And that's good news for Westjet, and it's good news for Calgary. But we'll be watching very carefully and making sure that those promises are kept.
Back to water, during the conversations that I heard, an option was to possibly increase the price of water, but that wasn't the first option. Is that something council would actually look at? You
know, I've spent a lot of time in the last 8 years kind of fixing the water prices. And in fact, we've been able to freeze and even reduce the prices people pay for water by making sure that suburban developers are actually paying for their water infrastructure. That said, what I thought was intriguing today, I'm not interested in a generalized increase in water rates to drive conservation. I don't think that's wise. I was interested today in hearing about conservation-based rate setting so that people who are really overusing, whether they're industrial or home users, might end up paying a little bit more. That's many years of conversation to try and figure out what that would look like. But it's intriguing to me to think about how we can protect the average water user, but make sure those who are overusing are actually paying for that use.
Is there anything in the near term that would indicate that Calgary needs to get more Vegas-like in terms of water conservation?
Well, you know, there's an interesting question that we raised today, which is, do we want to implement summer water use restrictions regardless of that particular year's water flow, so that we get used to it, so that we actually, you know, when times of drought are there, we're ready. And, you know, things like, you know, grass, right, is an interesting example. The grass in people's lawns is not a native species to this area, and it uses a lot of water. So are there ways that people can have incentives to xeriscape, to have more interesting and some ways very beautiful lawns that don't use that same kind of water? Are there ways the City of Calgary can do that? You know, I've long talked about the naturalization of our boulevards and taking out non-native grass species and putting in native species that are more drought resistant. So there's lots of conversations we can have about this.
Today was also more generally about what the city can do about climate change. Are there any other moves that you'd like to see the city making and more actively mitigating what we might see in the future?
Yeah, it's only been a couple of months since the City Council, I believe, unanimously passed our climate change and resilience strategy. And basically, just to be short about it, the city looks after three important aspects. It's air, land, and water. And what we have to really think about is how we're managing all three of those things. So when we look at the air, it's about investments in transit, about planning a city that is more walkable, that needs fewer vehicle miles driven. It's about our electric car strategy, all of that stuff together. When we think about land, it's really about our solid waste strategy, how we're reducing the use of landfills, how we're doing our recycling, but also reducing and reusing. It's also about efficient land use planning, developing neighborhoods that are more environmentally sustainable. This afternoon, you'll hear a little bit about the use of swales in new neighborhoods and managing water storage when it rains. These are all really important issues of how we work through that piece. Air, land, and then finally water, of course, is what we're talking about today. The City of Calgary is an extraordinarily good manager of our watershed. We got to get even better.
So just on the carbon tax, the Premier announced this morning it will be gone, if all goes according to plan, by the end of May.
Oh, really?
What would that mean for the city?
It'll save us a little bit of money. We are spending here at the City of Calgary, I think, between $6 and $10 million a year. I'll have to confirm that number on carbon tax. Of course, the real issue here is how are we going to fund the things that are being funded through the carbon levy? I wonder if the Premier said anything about the Green Line today, did he?
I don't think so.
And so, you know, he has in the past been very clear that the Green Line, which is the biggest thing that's being funded out of the carbon levy for Calgary, as well as the long-term transit plan, would be maintained under UCP governance. So as long as they're being maintained, then I will let people at other orders of government fight about the carbon levy.
Can I ask you in French too, just a reaction to carbon tax, votre réaction au fait que la taxe carbone va être éliminée rapidement?
Pour Calgary, la chose la plus importante est le ligne vert. Et il faut que le gouvernement trouve des autres sources pour payer pour la ligne verte. Et si on fait ça, peut-être on peut bâtir sur le taxe carbone entre les gouvernements provinciaux et fédéraux.
Est-ce que pour vous, c'est une bonne chose qu'on élimine la taxe sur le carbone?
Pour moi, c'est très important de penser pour Calgary. Et pour moi, les choses les plus importantes est le ligne verte.
Last question.
Taking a quick look at everything we're talking about today, is there a chance Calgary could follow suit and get rid of one-use straws?
Oh, you know, I actually do believe that the City of Calgary is a bit behind in terms of single-use plastics. Straws in the last year or so have sort of become the fashionable thing to talk about, but it's not really about straws. It really is about reducing our use of single-use plastics in all things we do. You know, we had the big story last week about those clamshell packages. So I think we have to take a more thoughtful measure in thinking about single-use plastic, and I know a number of my colleagues on council are thinking about the right policies moving forward. The good news about being a little bit behind some other cities is we can see what works and what didn't work.